I used to hang out with this girl who was a bit unstable, let's call her Jane. To cut a long story short, she came from a troubled family background, with her dad being a major source of her issues. When he passed away, Jane confided in me that she only attended the funeral to locate his grave. A few nights later, in the dead of night, Jane called me asking for a ride to the cemetery to vandalize his gravestone. Even though I would never condone such behavior, no matter how much I disliked someone, I could grasp why Jane harbored such intense feelings towards her father. Knowing she didn't have a license, I agreed to drive her, and off we went to the cemetery. After parking the car in the visitor lot, she retrieved a hammer and several grocery bags from her purse. She expressed her desire to enter, smash the gravestone into small pieces, bag them, and leave. While I was aware that trespassing into the cemetery after dark was illegal, I reluctantly agreed to accompany her, prioritizing her emotional needs. I cautioned her to keep watch for anyone in the vicinity while she carried out her plan. We quickly made our way to the grave, with Jane leading the path as she knew exactly where it was located. Despite the efficiency of our journey, I couldn't shake off the nerves that enveloped me. It wasn't just the fear of getting caught by the authorities. The eerie atmosphere of the cemetery itself felt unsettling, as if we were intruding upon the peaceful rest of the departed. Despite my apprehension, I maintained my composure and gave Jane the space she needed. As she knelt atop the relatively fresh grave, a flood of emotions overcame her, resulting in whispered curses and tears, each moment underscored by the profound intensity of her feelings. Suddenly, without warning, Jane began to scream, her cries echoing through the quiet of the cemetery. As she started striking the headstone with the hammer, I was taken aback, feeling a jolt of shock shoot through my body. I whirled around, ready to demand she quiet down, but one look told me she wouldn't hear me. She was going absolutely berserk, screaming and wailing at the top of her lungs while relentlessly attacking the stone with the hammer. Each blow only chipped off a small piece, and I realized we'd be there for quite some time at this rate. Her deafening racket filled me with terror, fearing someone in the nearby neighborhood might hear us. I imagined the chilling scenario of stumbling upon Jane's banshee-like shrieks in the graveyard, uncertain if she was a ghost or something far more sinister. My instinct for self-preservation kicked in as I found myself alone with this completely unhinged individual, surrounded by darkness and the silent company of the dead. I hesitated to approach her, fearing she might mistake me for the ghost of her father and react violently. However, as the deep-seated rage within Jane began to subside, exhaustion set in, and she eventually halted her frenzied assault on the headstone. Surveying the limited progress she had made, with 2/3 of the headstone still intact, she seemed to realize the futility of her actions. As she looked back at me, a glimmer of clarity appeared in her eyes for the first time. I had always been aware of Jane's unstable nature, but this moment revealed a level of madness that I had not previously witnessed. All our movements were sudden and jarring. She thrust the hammer into my chest, insisting that I take it and finish the job. Initially, I protested, reluctant to become further entangled in what I believed to be Jane's personal vendetta. However, she abruptly seized me by the ears, pulling my face inches from hers, and let out a deafening scream that nearly ruptured my eardrums. She demanded that I destroy the gravestone or face dire consequences, leaving me feeling trapped and unable to back out. Reluctantly, I accepted the task and resolved to complete it quickly. Despite being physically stronger than Jane, I lacked her inhibitions. As I hacked away at the stone, managing to break off larger pieces, Jane stood behind me, laughing maniacally, as if she were cheering me on in a twisted ritual. I attempted to ignore her, but her presence was impossible to ignore. I stole a glance over my shoulder and felt another chill run down my spine as I saw her brandishing a knife. Without warning, she knelt behind me, her arms wrapping around my shoulders as she whispered something sinister in my ear. I froze in place, my grip on the hammer faltering as I struggled to comprehend the surreal situation unfolding behind me. Despite my fear, I hesitated to swing the hammer, fearing I might inadvertently harm her. Then, in a moment that will forever haunt me, she extended both hands in front of me, one holding the knife. Before my horrified eyes, she sliced open her palm, unleashing a torrent of blood that cascaded onto her wrist. With an eerie chant in an unknown language, she smeared her bloodied hand across my face, tracing a path from my forehead to my chin, and then across my throat before gripping the base of my neck with a vice-like hold. She asked if I could taste the blood, and reluctantly, I admitted that I could. With a twisted sense of pleasure, she released her grip and returned to standing on the grave. She screamed at the top of her lungs, declaring that these would be the final tears she shed for her father. With her eyes fixed on the sky, she raised her hand toward the moon, clenching her fist to squeeze out drops of blood from her wound, which cascaded down her face. I watched the surreal scene unfold, feeling detached and overwhelmed. Eventually, she turned back to me, her face streaked with blood and tears, and urged me to finish the task. By this point, I was thoroughly terrified of Jane and eager to leave. I obeyed her command, smashing the gravestone to bits as instructed. Finally, when the deed was done, I was relieved to put an end to the disturbing ordeal. I managed to persuade Jane that it was time to leave, and thankfully, she appeared ready. However, throughout the process of picking up the broken pieces, she giggled incessantly, unnerving me even further. Somehow, we completed the task without drawing any unwanted attention, and Jane dashed back to my car. I drove her home and dropped her off, but as she exited my car, she attempted to convince me to spend the night with her. Despite having anticipated that night for months, I knew it wouldn't end well for me, so I fabricated an excuse about having to work the next day. In the morning, I severed all ties with Jane and have been avoiding her out of fear ever since. Story 2. I'll always remember the time I was assigned to work nighttime security at the cemetery, a job I never desired as a security guard. Unfortunately, circumstances left me with no choice. The agency I worked for forced me to transfer following an incident that I'm not at liberty to discuss, but it involved an alleged assault on a child with average parents while on duty. Reluctantly, I accepted the transfer to the cemetery, as I wasn't prepared to be unemployed. Despite my apprehensions about working in such a location, I had no other option. This particular cemetery held significant historical value as the oldest in the city. However, it had recently experienced a spate of grave robberies, prompting the administration to contract nighttime security services. Although grave robberies had only occurred twice in recent history, the proximity of these incidents within a short span raised concerns about the potential for future occurrences. Thus, I found myself thrust into the role of ensuring the security of this historic site, despite my reservations. Being the first security guard assigned to the cemetery, I had no predecessors to offer guidance on what to expect. Restlessness consumed me on my first night, prompting numerous walks through the burial grounds in an attempt to desensitize myself to the eerie darkness. However, rather than alleviating my unease, these walks only intensified my sense of dread. During one of my patrols, I stumbled upon a recently robbed grave. Though the grave had been refilled, the grass had yet to fully recover, and the marker showed signs of erosion. Despite my initial shock, I paid my respects and continued my rounds, thinking little of the encounter. In the following nights, nothing out of the ordinary occurred, making for a rather uneventful start to the job. However, the grueling schedule of working from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., 3 nights a week, took its toll on me. Accustomed to wrapping up my shifts by the early hours of the morning, I struggled with drowsiness halfway through each shift, finding little relief in the weak coffee available at the booth. By the time my second round of shifts rolled over with nobody around to notice, I didn't concern myself with appearing weary on the job. Completing my first week, I assumed my supervisors would be less vigilant with monitoring the camera footage. Rather than forcing myself to stay awake during moments of exhaustion and boredom, I allowed myself to sleep as needed. I reasoned that the grave robbers wouldn't risk returning for a third attempt with me on watch, and I had no qualms about taking advantage of the agency's time, given their treatment of me. However, there was one entity that took issue with my sleeping on the job. On my final night of work, my exhaustion from previous shifts caught up with me, and I quickly found myself dozing off in my chair. Before long, I had fallen into a deep sleep and drifted into a nightmare. The dream began innocuously, but abruptly turned into a terrifying ordeal as I was suddenly gripped by excruciating pain in my stomach. I screamed, jolting awake to find myself face to face with a ghastly old woman wielding a shovel, mercilessly plunging it into my abdomen and tearing out my insides. Paralyzed with fear, I could only watch helplessly as she eviscerated me in the most vivid nightmare I had ever experienced. Desperately, I forced myself awake, my eyes snapping open in terror. As I regained my senses, I noticed the same elderly woman standing just beyond the toll booth window, her gaze fixed on me. With a gasp, I recoiled and tumbled off my chair, momentarily losing sight of her. When I scrambled to my feet, she had vanished, leaving me trembling with fear. Despite my terror, I knew it was my responsibility to investigate any potential trespassers. Reluctantly, I ventured out into the cold night under the watchful glow of the full moon, my flashlight casting beams in every direction as I scanned the surroundings. At first, I couldn't spot anyone, but my heart skipped a beat when I noticed a figure lurking near the back of the property, shrouded by the trees. I called out to them, but they remained silent. My attention wavered for a moment as I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, only to realize it was just a passing animal startled by my presence. It was a logical explanation that brought some reassurance. However, my sense of unease persisted as I turned back to the mysterious figure by the woods, only to find them vanished without a trace. I couldn't comprehend how such a frail old woman could cover so much ground in such a short span of time, but I found myself marching over to the spot where I last saw her without a second thought. As I traversed the graveyard, every instinct in me screamed to turn back. It seemed as though every creature in the woods was in a state of frenzy, with flocks of birds taking flight simultaneously, their shrill cries piercing the night air, and even the normally elusive coyotes joining in the cacophony. The surroundings felt alive with a warning, urging me not to proceed, but against my better judgment, I pressed on, driven by an inexplicable force in my gut. Fear gripped me as I trudged forward, compelled by an inexplicable urgency to keep moving. I couldn't shake the feeling that stopping would invite some unknown danger, so I pressed on until I reached the edge of the graveyard. With my flashlight scanning the area, I called out to the figure I had seen earlier, but there was no response. As suddenly as the chaos had begun, the forest fell into an eerie silence. Every creature, from the birds to the bugs, ceased their clamor, leaving me bewildered and disoriented. Confusion clouded my thoughts as I began to turn around, only to realize that I was standing atop one of the graves that had been robbed, the resting place of the elderly woman I had encountered the week before. Before I could react, a pair of strong hands clamped around my throat, cutting off my breath, and my feet were swept out from under me. I struggled against my assailant, unable to see them in the darkness, as they mercilessly slammed my face into the freshly disturbed earth. Each blow threatened to render me unconscious from lack of oxygen. The rough touch of the hand abruptly vanished, leaving me in a state of panic as I scrambled to my feet. But there was no one in sight, as if the whole ordeal had been a figment of my imagination. Yet, it had felt undeniably real, sending chills down my spine. I couldn't bring myself to finish my shift that night. I fled to my car with my tail between my legs and quit the job on the spot. Since that harrowing event, the memory has haunted me, and I've pieced together various explanations over the years. Perhaps spiritually, the old woman whose grave was disturbed didn't take kindly to my negligence on the job. Whatever the case, it served as a stark reminder never to let my guard down again. I've never been one to believe in superstitions, but sometimes life presents us with experiences that challenge our assumptions. Even now, when I'm at work and feel the temptation to slack off, I catch a glimpse of that woman out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting reminder of the lesson she imparted. Story 3. When I was about 13 years old, on the night of Halloween, I found myself in a situation that has haunted me for decades. I lived in a relatively new suburb at the time, part of a small town that was gradually expanding alongside the freeway. The area looked vastly different back then, less developed and with a sense of emptiness, especially evident in the nearby cemetery. The cemetery, situated a few turns off the main road on what used to be the outskirts, was mostly vacant at the time. Not enough people had passed away to fill it up yet. However, that night, my two friends, whom I'll refer to as Aaron and Michael to protect their identities, and I decided to forego the traditional trick-or-treating in favor of exploring the empty graveyard. Aware that our nighttime escapade would likely land us in trouble, we took precautions to cover our tracks. We disguised ourselves by hastily throwing together makeshift costumes and began the night by pilfering a few bowls of candy set out for trick-or-treaters, mixing them all together to create the illusion that we had indeed participated in the Halloween tradition as our parents expected. Once we had our cover story in place, we embarked on our journey to the cemetery, which required traversing about a mile off the beaten path to avoid detection. This involved scaling a fence that surrounded a large drainage pond for the freeway, navigating across its banks, and then hopping another fence to enter the cemetery grounds. As we left the residential streets behind, we found ourselves enveloped in darkness, minimizing the risk of being spotted by passing cars on the main road. Feeling a false sense of security, we roamed around the cemetery, relishing in the thrill of sneaking around after dark. We playfully tried to startle each other, laughing at our own antics. Then, stumbling upon a few unmarked gravestones near a crypt, we impulsively decided to smash them together, finding amusement in the destruction. We even pocketed a couple of chunks of stone as souvenirs. Despite our attempts to entertain ourselves, the vast emptiness of the cemetery weighed heavily on us. Unlike the crowded cemeteries we were accustomed to, this one seemed eerily sparse, with vast expanses of uninterrupted grass. As boredom began to set in, we sought a place to rest, choosing to lean against the backs of some gravestones to avoid sitting directly on top of the graves. As we sat there, enjoying the distant lights of the freeway that seemed to stretch on for miles, the eerie tranquility was shattered by the sound of footsteps behind us. Instantly, our playful demeanor turned to fear, and we spun around to confront the source of the noise. But to our horror, there was nothing there, just the silent rows of gravestones looming in the darkness. Then, the whispers began, softly at first, but growing louder and more insistent. They called out our names, sending chills down our spines. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination, but the voices persisted, seeming to emanate from the very air around us. In our panicked state, we clutched onto the broken chunks of stone as if they could protect us from whatever unseen force was tormenting us. With trembling steps, we cautiously approached the source of the whispers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person we thought must be playing a cruel prank on us. But as we drew nearer, the voices grew clearer, and we heard it say something that filled us with dread, something that has haunted me ever since. For context, my friend Aaron's mother was extremely ill with cancer at the time, which was part of the reason why we were acting out by breaking into the cemetery in the first place. Aaron was in a funk, understandably angry at the world. He was our friend, someone we did stuff with, but his emotions were understandably intense given his mother's condition. When the voice claimed to be the ghost of Aaron's mother, Aaron froze in his tracks. I could only imagine the tumult of emotions racing through his mind, a mix of disbelief, grief, and perhaps even a flicker of hope. It must have been overwhelming for a 13-year-old to process. Aaron tried to push back, to cast out the notion that it could be his mother's spirit, but the voice persisted, digging deeper, claiming that she had just passed away moments ago. Aaron knew it was a lie, but the voice didn't seem to care. It began to cry, accusing Aaron of not being in the neighborhood like a good boy. The accusation added another layer of guilt and confusion to Aaron's already turbulent emotions. His father wasn't able to find him. She died wondering where her son was and why he didn't love her enough to be there. Aaron yelled again that it wasn't true that he couldn't be, but it struck him so badly. He was failing to hold back his tears. Michael and I started trying our best to console him, not really knowing how. But then the mood changed on a dime when the unknown voice stopped crying and started laughing. Then it didn't sound like the ghost of a woman anymore, but a snickering boy. We looked over and saw someone crawling out of their hiding spot behind the gravestone, somebody we knew, but I can't say his name. It was a couple years older than us, and he was a neighborhood bully. Must have seen his sneaking off and followed us so he could pull some kind of prank like this for kicks. All of Aaron's sadness turned into anger in an instant as he charged toward the bully who was laughing so hard. He didn't notice how pissed off Aaron was. Nobody expected him to do what he did next. Aaron tackled the boy to the ground and started beating on him, screaming furiously that it was way too far to joke about someone's sick mother dying. Michael and I agreed, and we hated being bullied by this kid too, so we let it happen, figuring it would teach the target a lesson. Unfortunately, we didn't notice before it was too late that Aaron wasn't just pounding the kid in the face with his fists, but with the chunk of gravestone he'd broken off a few minutes prior. After just a few more seconds, there was no sound or movement from the bully, no indication at all that he was still fighting back. Michael and I exchanged a worried look right before deciding that this, in fact, was going too far and we needed to stop it. We rushed over to Aaron and pulled him off the bully. As we held him back, we looked down at the other kid and saw just how badly he'd been beaten. The jagged stone had turned his face into an unrecognizable bloody mess. There were deep gashes all over his face and head. Even in the darkness, we knew. But we still waited for him to get up or at least groan in pain, but he never did. Gradually, Aaron let go of his rage and came to realize what he had done. Michael and I were already stunned. He broke away from us, then rushed back in panic, trying to wake the kid up by shaking and yelling his name, but none of it was any good. He finally looked back at us and asked us to say that he was just unconscious and not dead. Only one of us knew how to check. I could see that Michael was shaking as he stepped to the body and knelt down, checking for a pulse. He checked and checked, even bringing his ear down to the kid's face to check for breathing. But unfortunately, he only confirmed the worst. Aaron had killed our neighborhood bully. After an internal silence, Aaron snapped us out of our daze. He took charge of the moment and let us do the cover-up. We all thought about just coming clean, but we were so afraid of the repercussions. Well, Aaron was, and there was a small, sick part of us that was glad that it happened, to be honest. Holy cow, we deserved it to a certain extent. Or so we tried to convince ourselves. Besides, we had no idea how to act in a situation like that, so we just followed the orders we heard. We dragged the body to the fence around the drainage pond and ripped the bottom of the chain-link fence out of the dirt so we could pull the body under to the other side. Then we grabbed a gravestone and a bunch of broken chunks and threw them over, including the ones we thought were going to be souvenirs for the night. We took off his shoes and his jeans, then slid a gravestone underneath his shirt, fastening it to his chest by tying his jeans around his torso. We tied the shoes to his ankles and filled them with stones. Afterward, we dragged the body into the pond and held it up until he was neck deep. Then we pushed it toward the center and let go, watching him sink as we turned around and came out of the water, looking like completely different people. We hurriedly closed the fence, trying at least a little bit to cover our tracks. So we didn't look obviously drenched before we went back to the neighborhood, and we needed to make sure that the body wouldn't immediately float to the surface. After throwing everything related to the killing in the pond and washing our hands of the blood, we hopped the fence and sat on the banks for a while where we couldn't be seen. It was totally silent the entire time. The blood stains had been rinsed off his clothes, but we would never be able to look at them without seeing them. It was on our hands now too, and we had to live with that. It was hard to pretend to be normal kids after that twisted coming-of-age moment. The disappearance was the talk of the town for days, even weeks, until the body finally floated to the surface. A few weeks later, the murder was discovered. Nobody ever suspected us, but the publicity of the case going unsolved was torturous, especially for Aaron. While Michael and I were able to get back to some semblance of normalcy after a couple of years, Aaron was never the same. When his mother finally died, he never talked to us again. He never made any other friends and kind of became the town degenerate, and only Michael and I knew the real reason why. When he was 17, he ran away from home, and he's never been seen or heard from since.